Welcome to the Week 4 lecture on Provincial America and the beginnings of the American struggle for independence, or the roots for the American struggle for independence. Anglicization refers to the process of becoming more English. And in the 18th century, this transformation took place in the American colonies in a variety of ways. Culturally, the colonies increasingly emulated British society. Imports of British goods rose dramatically, and colonists adopted British fashions, styles of home decor, and the use of newspapers, especially in port cities. This cultural shift was often intensified during periods of warfare, which were common throughout the 18th century. Socially, colonial family structures mirrored those in Britain, with wealthy colonists holding positions of power in government. Primogeniture, the practice of passing down land to the eldest son, was widespread, ensuring that land remained intact rather than being divided or sold. Families who couldn't provide for all their children followed British norms, favoring older sons, while younger sons were often pushed to move to the frontier or take up a trade. Women in the colonies also followed English customs. They received dowries from their fathers upon marriage, but under the practice of coverture, their husbands made all legally binding decisions. Women worked hard in colonial households, engaging in tasks such as spinning cloth, but by the 1700s, it was increasingly rare for them to inherit land or estates after their husband's death. Social norms also favored men, who were rarely convicted of sexual offenses, while women were harshly punished for any perceived indiscretions. In the South, 90% of enslaved people in British North America were brought to the southern colonies, leading to the creation of the Old South. Wealthy slaveholding planters dominated the region's social hierarchy, followed by a large class of small planters, while tens of thousands of enslaved people performed the majority of the manual labor. This reliance on slavery transformed the social structure from a society with slaves to a full-fledged slave society, with political power concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy planters, such as those who ran the House of Burgesses. The region prospered in the 18th century through the production and trade of staple crops like tobacco, rice, indigo, and wheat, particularly in the Chesapeake area, which helped to strengthen its economic ties to Britain. The mid-Atlantic colonies, by contrast, were marked by their ethnic and religious diversity, a result of significant immigration. Germans, Scots-Irish, and Irish Catholics settled in the region, creating a pluralistic society. A new form of indentured servitude, known as redemptioners, emerged, allowing families to bind themselves to the same master in exchange for passage to the colonies. Most redemptioners eventually settled in Pennsylvania, where they grew wheat. Further inland, many immigrants were pushed into the backcountry regions of Virginia and the Carolinas. These areas were less refined than coastal settlements, with inhabitants developing a reputation for being clannish, violent, heavy drinkers, and hostile toward Native Americans, creating tensions in the region. In New England, the population dynamics differed significantly. More people were leaving the region than arriving, leading to relative isolation from the rest of the colonies. A decline in life expectancy due to outbreaks of smallpox and diphtheria, particularly among later generations who lacked exposure to these diseases, slowed population growth. As earlier farm-based exports declined, New England's economy shifted towards shipbuilding, which became the region's primary economic activity. This change reflected broader trends in the region as its economy and social structure evolved in response to external and internal pressures. In colonial America, few colonists owned books or participated in the political and intellectual debates of the day, with New England being a notable exception due to its tradition of town hall meetings. Boston became the print capital of the colonies in the 17th century, largely because Massachusetts was the only colony with a printing press for much of that period. This early advantage allowed Boston to lead the way in newspaper publishing, a trend that eventually spread to Philadelphia, New York, and other colonial cities. By the 18th century, every colony had at least one newspaper, fostering communication and the exchange of ideas. The trial of John Peter Zenger, the publisher of the New York Weekly Journal, was a significant moment in colonial media history. Accused of seditious libel, a common law crime of criticizing government officials, Zenger's acquittal in 1735 set a precedent for freedom of the press and encouraged a more open exchange of political ideas. Newspapers played a crucial role in spreading Enlightenment ideas, which was an intellectual movement concerned with human affairs throughout the colonies. Colonial weekly newspapers often devoted space to European matters and Enlightenment thinkers, sometimes to the extent that local issues went unreported, as they were assumed to be common knowledge among readers. This dissemination of ideas helped to shape colonial thought and set the stage for later political and philosophical developments. In the 1730s and 1740s, religious revivals swept across the Protestant world, deeply affecting both England and the American colonies. Evangelical preachers, committed to spreading the teachings of the Bible in an emotional and impassioned style, held revivals that resulted in the conversion of many listeners. These preachers traveled throughout the colonies, drawing large crowds to their sermons. One of the most popular figures of the Great Awakening was George Whitefield, who began preaching in England before traveling to America. His sermons attracted thousands of people, sometimes up to 30,000, thanks in part to his previous experience as an actor, which contributed to the theatrical nature of his delivery. However, Whitefield and other revivalist preachers were often distrusted by traditional Anglican ministers. The revivalist movement of the Great Awakening led to significant disruptions throughout the colonies. In the South, there were concerns about the impact of evangelical messages on enslaved people, especially as memories of recent slave revolts lingered. While Whitefield's authenticity and style won him many followers, other preachers who lacked his charisma faced resistance. The movement also shattered the unity of New England's Congregational Church, as many converts left to form separate churches or join Baptist congregations. These revivals created new connections between Britain and its colonies, as newspapers circulated stories about revivals happening across the empire, allowing readers to follow the events in real time. The Great Awakening transformed American religious life, reshaping the religious landscape that had previously been dominated by Congregationalists in New England, Quakers in the Mid-Atlantic, and Anglicans in the South. Methodists, Presbyterian, and Baptists gained significant traction, while anti-revivalist denominations such as the Anglicans and Quakers suffered heavy losses. From 1739 to 1763, the British Empire in the Americas was almost continuously engaged in warfare, as the British, French, Spanish, and Native American groups vied for control over North America. These conflicts included the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Jenkins's Ear, and King George's War, alongside internal struggles like the Stono Rebellion and other slave uprisings incited by the Spanish. Although these wars pushed back the frontiers of British settlement and created tensions as colonists moved into new lands, none of these conflicts were ultimately decisive. One of the key points of contention during this period was competition for trade with Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley, leading to ongoing conflict between British colonies, Native American groups, and the French. The expansion into the Ohio River Valley escalated tensions, with colonies, settlers, and imperial powers clashing. The French attempted to prevent British encroachment by constructing a series of forts, including Fort Duquesne, which was set at modern-day Pittsburgh. When the colony of Virginia sent George Washington to reinforce British claims, the French had already taken the fort, and the resulting skirmish in May of 1754 marked the beginning of the French and Indian War. In an effort to address native grievances and promote colonial unity, the British organized a meeting in Albany where Benjamin Franklin presented his Albany Plan of Union. However, the plan, which called for centralized command, was rejected by all the colonies, as they still saw themselves as too different to unite. The French and Indian War, known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, was fought on multiple fronts, including the New England and Mid-Atlantic frontiers, the Mediterranean, and as far as Austria and India. Although Spain remained neutral for much of the war, the conflict involved British regulars and colonial militias fighting side by side. This led many colonists to see themselves as equal or even superior to the British regulars, whom they viewed as arrogant, though the regulars often looked down on the colonists. Under the leadership of William Pitt, the British war effort expanded, but the conflict grew increasingly costly. The war finally ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, in which Britain gained control of most of the European claimed territory in North America, including all of New France up to the Mississippi River, except for New Orleans, and Florida. The war was decisive in its scope, and the British envisioned a new era of trade and partnership that would bring prosperity. However, Native Americans rejected the terms of the peace settlement, and the war left Britain deeply in debt, and the colonists were eager to move into the newly acquired territories, setting the stage for future conflicts.